am just very pleased to be able to welcome Ron back to Horizon House. He's been a speaker here before, and I think many of you might be familiar with his book, My Unforgotten Seattle. And just a very, he has such an extensive background in many fields, but just a few of his accomplishments and some specific things is he's a journalist, an activist, historian, and fundraiser. And he's known for his contribution to the International District, the city of Seattle and beyond, and to include serving on the National Council of the Humanities. As a journalist and editor for Seattle's International Examiner, and if you're not familiar with the International Examiner, it is the oldest and largest nonprofit Pan-Asian American newspaper in the Pacific Northwest. And he writes in his book about when he went to work as journalist and then editor for the Examiner, that it was an opportunity for him to combine his interest in journalism with social justice issues. And he certainly did that over his 13 years at the Examiner. He has completed major oral history projects, including the aging Filipino immigrants who, in the early 1930s, formed the Cannery Workers Union, and he interviewed them late in life about their experiences. And he also completed the Chinese Oral History Project of Seattle. As director of the Wing Luke Museum, he led the fund drive and the visioning for the redesign of the new museum. And his fundraising has also been key to expanded health services for Pacific Islander immigrants and other underserved populations. And it's continuing as he works on a development for aging in place on Beacon Hill. Today, he introduces us to Beacon Hill through his personal experiences as a Beacon Hill kid, and his highly recommended memoir and history, My Unforgotten Seattle. I want to mention it's now available as an audio book, and maybe Ron can tell us where we can procure that. It's hard, either hardcover copies are difficult to locate. For anyone or for those of us who may not know immediately where Beacon Hill is or haven't had the opportunity to be there, we thought a map might be useful for people to locate it within the city. And it's basically from Dearborn down to the city limits. It's a big swath of territory. And if you look on the lower right-hand corner, you can get some idea of where it sits within the larger city of Seattle. So with that, I'd like to welcome Ron to the podium.
Good morning. All right, we're live.
Are you comfortable with the podium if you can turn it a little ways?
Yeah, this should work for me. So, funny story. I was actually waiting outside Susan and I were trying to figure out where the heck am I, because I've been here before, and anyway, it's almost like we were talking different languages. We must have been within a couple feet of each other. Oh, okay. So it's almost like we were talking different languages. So anyway, I had a pleasant 15 minutes out front, snacking on food. My throat's a little dry, so that's hence the water. But it's always great to be here because I think we have a lot of shared history. There are a lot of locals who grew up here, very civically engaged, and I find them at Horizon House. And I'm thinking myself, well, shoot, I'm 71. It's about time, limited mobility, stay around some folks who are civically engaged and mentally still active. So, who knows? Another year I could be sitting in the audience listening to one of you talk. Anyway, so the topic is Beacon Hill. And I thought there's a lot I could say about Beacon Hill, but I thought I'll say a few words of prelude and then read from my book. Because in my book, there's a chapter titled Childhood. Is that an alarm for us to leave or anything? Or? Oh, okay. Or it could be musical accompaniment or something. Anyway. Okay. Can you hear me above the noise? Should I keep going? Okay. All right. So there's a chapter titled Childhood on Beacon Hill. And what I was hoping, it's not the best chapter in the book. There's quite a few chapters. But it's a chapter that really transports me back to childhood. And it also talks, in many respects, about the movement of Chinese Americans, like my family, immigrant family, from Chinatown to other places in the city. So it's kind of the first venture outside of the safe zone where everybody spoke the same language. So Beacon Hill was that for me. It still is for many families. I do a lot of work with some of the immigrant community through some of my community activity. So still is that same way, and it has that freshness of childhood, growing up, the city. But as you know, those of you, how many of you by chance grew up on Beacon Hill or lived here? Yes, okay. Okay, yeah. So, anybody else? Okay. And, yeah, okay, yeah. And how many of you, by the way, are longtime Seattleites? Yeah, so good number. So a lot of these places will be recognizable to you. But again, I thought, well, let me share some of my memories and see if they resonate with some of you who are familiar with the neighborhood and with Seattle. Before I came here, I was looking around my house, and any of you recognize this? Okay, it's a Seattle World's Fair official guidebook. I mention it, reference it here on my childhood on Beacon Hill, because that was the era. I also had, and I'll show, I can pass this around, but I was part of the reading club, Seattle Reading Club. Any of you grew up doing the reading club, Seattle Public Library, where you read 10, 12 books and you got your name and you got a free book and that kind of stuff? Okay, so this is my reading club, thing where you filled out the books you read. This was from 1963. Then the last thing, which I actually referenced, any of you have these little transistor radios when you're growing up, with the little batteries that would run out after like a couple hours, and you could barely hear the between all the static. So this also, as I was preparing to come here, I said, I'll bring a few things that might resonate with folks. So I'm gonna just pass these around, and feel free to look at them while I speak. But I got to get them back, because those are my little triggers for doing my memoirs, found things that trigger memory. Okay, where was I? Let me find my chapter that I was on. And I practiced reading this this morning, so I'm guessing it would take about 25 minutes or so. And as I read, feel free, if you have a question that pops up because of something I said, raise your hand or shout or do whatever. I'm hoping this is really more about a dialogue and, again, triggering memories rather than simply me sitting here, reading like a robot. Childhood on Beacon Hill. In 1958, we moved into a new split-level brick house on a vacant lot at 1919 South College Street. It was perched on the southwest corner of 20th Avenue and South College Street in the north end of Beacon Hill. The house number 1919 was auspicious in Chinese. It is a homonym for longevity. So in Chinese, it's pronounced Yit Qiu, Yit Qiu. Yit means one, Qiu means long or long time. So we had a great number. Our house was a great number. In that same year, Hung Hong, and that's my uncle, Hung Hong's family also bought a new house on Beacon Hill, a little south of us on 7510 Beacon Avenue South. By the 1960s, redlining, or the use of restrictive covenants barring people of color from buying land, was swept aside by the open housing movement. Families like ours started relocating to Beacon Hill. Our neighbors were Japanese, Filipino, and African Americans. Italians had settled there a generation earlier. Beacon Hill was sometimes called Garlic Gulch, right? Some of you remember? We didn't know one another's traditions, but we got along. We didn't lock our doors. If there was discord, it was hidden inside the home. I never felt unsafe outside alone, even at night. The streets around our house were simple dirt roads sprinkled with gravel. I don't know that there's any more of those type of streets left, right? They're all paved over. After a heavy rainstorm, the roads turned sloshy. Heavy trucks left behind deep grooves. One snowy winter, Cindy Chu, a neighbor whose father worked as a cook at the Hong Kong restaurant, and I should mention, Hong Kong restaurant was really where my father worked as a waiter for many years. I don't know if any of you remember it. The old Hong Kong restaurant, I see a bunch of shaking heads. Anyway, Cindy Chu, a neighbor whose father worked as a cook at the Hong Kong restaurant, rounded up a few of us to build a massive 6-foot wide snowball, which we pushed into the middle of College Street. Nowadays, you try to find, it'll be moved aside, within a matter of half an hour. During grade school, we played hopscotch, drawing a rectangular court on the sidewalk with a piece of chalk. We played with a coin or a beaded keychain. I used the old Beacon Hill School. Okay, yes, all right, we're on memory lane, same track. Okay. And there's a chapter on Beacon Hill Grade School, which I won't read. You can invite me back for another day, or we can have lunch or something. We played with a coin or a beaded keychain. I used the silver name bracelet I wore to grade school. I don't know if any of you remember that. Yep, see another shaking heads. Okay. We had a small red radio flyer wagon to pull one another up and down the sidewalk. When I got older, most of the kids on Beacon Hill got red roller derby skateboards. My two brothers and I each got one. They didn't last long. After a week or two of launching ourselves down pitched driveways, the metal wheels became pockmarked and wouldn't turn. We abandoned them in the garage. None of us ever got a bicycle. I remember back in that era, nobody had any money, so like if you got one thing, you were really happy. If I wanted to ride, I had to wait in line to borrow a small bike from a girl up the street. When it was my turn, I circled the block several times before plunging myself down the steep hill on College Street. I love the feeling my heart pound and the wind rush through my hair. Harry, a Japanese-American boy across the street, came over to play on a new swing set my father assembled on the red patio in our front yard. He was a bit of a bully, much bigger and stronger than I was. He never picked on me, but he seemed to always get into fights with other kids in the neighborhood. After he got into trouble, his father beat him. We heard his whimpers from the house. And many years later, I should mention Harry, I found out from his sister that his father had an alcohol problem. Apparently was very abusive to the mother and so forth. But I didn't know that as a child. I just was scared of Harry. Did you know that you're going to hell if you think bad thoughts, Ronald? He told me as we swung side by side, each trying to go higher than the other. What do you mean? I asked. He told me that after you died, your soul ascended to heaven, or it went below and burned forever in the terrible fires of hell. For example, he explained, if you're greedy and you keep thinking about getting a big elephant, that's a bad thought. You better not think about that, otherwise you're going to hell. As I tried to digest this odd suggestion, he came back at me. You're not thinking about getting a big elephant, are you? He looked me in the eye. I didn't know how to respond. He had planted an image in my brain. As we continued to swing, he kept warning me that I was going to burn in hell. I was thoroughly bewildered. I thought Harry knew more than I did. My fear lingered for a day or two. I finally concluded that his concept of heaven and hell didn't make any sense. I could do without his religion. Before and after school, I plopped down on my stomach and elbows in the living room, several feet in front of a black and white Zenith television with tapered legs. Every 5 minutes, I had to get up to fuss with the rabbit ear antennas and the vertical hold or horizontal hold dials. You guys remember all that stuff? Yeah. I ignored my mother's repeated warnings that I was going to go blind from sitting so close. We watched Stan Borson, a genial accordion-playing Scandinavian, J.P. Patches, a clown who lived in the mythical city dump, Captain Puget, a ship captain who sang sea chanties and introduced Pacific Northwest history, and Wanda Wanda, a princess-like storyteller. I love the unscripted horseplay between J.P. Patches and the man who played Gertrude, the telephone operator, and the cartoon breaks. After school, I ran home to catch The Adventures of Superman, starring George Reeves. The busiest part of Beacon Hill was the junction, the wide intersection where 15th Avenue and Beacon Avenue South crossed. My place of shelter, the Beacon Hill Public Library, was in the middle. There were two gas stations, Richfield and Shell, the Beacon Theater, Pacific National Bank, one of the first bank branches on the hill, a corner grocery called Tomboy Market, a Japanese optometrist, a barbershop, and Owen's Pharmacy. Near the junction was Perry Co's South China Restaurant, a chop suey house with a smoky bar called the Dragon Room Lounge. After school, I stopped at Owen's Pharmacy for comics and candy. When I opened the front door, a little bell chimed. The pharmacist, a soft-spoken man with a mustache and white coat, looked up and smiled. His name was Bob Ohashi. He prepared prescription refills. I should mention, many years later, when I joined the Wing Luke Museum. He was on the board of directors of the Wing Luke Museum, and it was marvelous to reconnect somebody as an adult to an adult. It was kind of a strange feeling, but that happened. Bob Ohashi prepared prescription refills. The comics were in several spinning wire display racks. I pored over my favorites: adventure comics featuring the Legion of Superheroes, action comics with Superman, and Harvey comics, Richie Rich, Casper the Friendly Ghost, and Baby Huey. My candy picks were Big Hunk. Does anybody remember that by chance? Okay. It was 5 cents, wasn't it, or something like that? Yeah. Big Hunk. Cracker Jack. Red Hots, a cinnamon-flavored candy. Cinnamon toothpicks. I don't know if that's even around anymore, right? Tome Ame rice candy and long strands of red licorice. I bought packs of Topps bubblegum, which came with Major League Baseball trading cards. I wanted a full set of the New York Yankee players. They were my favorite team. Yankee home games were broadcast on TV on the weekend. But cards for slugger Mickey Mantle, pitcher Whitey Ford, and catcher Elston Howard proved elusive. I eventually gave up in frustration. Mickey Mantle was my hero. I had saved a July 30, 1965 Life magazine cover article that I discovered on a side table in the waiting area of the Hong Kong restaurant, which again is where my father worked and where I worked as a busboy for many years. Titled Mantle's Misery, it cast him as a brave hero from humble origins. At age 33, he was in his 15th year with the Yankees. He limped on chronically damaged legs, nearly depleted of cartilage, legs requiring thick wraps. I rooted for him when I saw him come up to bat on TV. When I was about 10, I acquired a Mickey Mantle card printed on the back of a box of orange-flavored Jell-O powder. You guys remember that? There were cards and stuff on the back of Jell-O? Anybody? Okay, I see one shaking head. All right. I wish I'd saved that stuff because it'd be worth a heck of a lot of money. I could have retired early. My mother made Jell-O whenever someone was sick and couldn't eat solids. The Mickey Mantle card was among a small stash of treasured baseball cards clipped from the back of Jell-O boxes. The number 3 bus, an electric trolley, was the main public transit line from Beacon Hill to downtown. Dozens of loud Chinese women crowded the buses. They worked in Pioneer Square sewing factories and crab packing plants near the waterfront. They wore bulky ski jackets and brightly knitted gloves and hats, and they toted lunches packed with large plastic thermoses. The crab workers wore sturdy rubber boots. When they came home, non-Chinese passengers edged as far away from them as they could, recoiling from the fishy odor clinging to their bodies. The trolley line ended at Beacon Avenue and South Spokane Street, near the fire station. I should mention my mother was a sewing worker many, many years in Pioneer Square. Again, there's a separate chapter about her life as well in the book. Among the crab cannery workers was my second auntie, Gam Goon, who had lived with us in the University District House, where I was an infant. During the very early years of my life, we're in University District where there are quite a few hand laundries, which serviced a lot of the students. Because back then, this is before people had washing machines and dryers in the home. Let's see, where was I? Gam Goon's husband, Hung Hong, died in 1962. She worked in the cannery to support her family, which included 4 children, 2 born in China and 2 in Seattle. Hung Hong was only 54 when he passed away. The grand civic event of my childhood was the Seattle World's Fair in 1962. How many of you went to when, yeah, okay, almost everybody, okay. It was called the Century 21 Exposition. The fair included a new science pavilion and the monorail. The 605-foot tall Space Needle supplanted Smith Tower as the city's architectural jewel. My father took us to the World's Fair shortly after it opened. I was in the 4th grade. I was dazzled by the futuristic science displays and carnival rides, including the Wild Mouse, a roller coaster, Sky Ride, cable cars transporting passengers high over the fairgrounds, and bumper cars. I was disappointed we didn't get to take the elevator up to the top of the Space Needle. Probably because it costs money, I'm assuming, right? We dined on snacks inside the food circus, an old armory building gussied up to look like a giant festival tent. I tasted cotton candy for the first time. Outside, we roamed through the Fun Forest amusement park. There were games like skee ball, balloon darts, and knock over the milk bottles. I desperately wanted to play so I could win a big stuffed animal, toy, or candy treat. My parents gave me a few coins. I tossed one inside a circled area on a table, winning a yellow stuffed teddy bear. I was ecstatic. I named it Lucky. I was shocked that my folks let me play. Neither gambled. They shunned the Chinese lotteries, even eschewing casual games of mahjong with friends. My mother had friends whose husbands were gambling addicts who squandered their hard-earned restaurant wages behind closed doors in Chinatown. My mother sternly warned that if she ever caught me gambling, she used the Chinese term "ubok," I would be severely punished. When your grandfather was a young boy, his mother caught him betting with Chinese coins, she recounted in Chinese. She beat him until his behind was red. He never, ever gambled again. Her words stayed with me. I never learned to play mahjong. I have never purchased a lottery ticket in my life. It's funny how parents' little lessons stay with you, right? Forever. We took home a 13-inch ceramic Space Needle souvenir from the fair. It became a permanent feature on our fireplace mantle. Any of you by chance still have that ceramic, that Space Needle thing? It's quite an artifact now. I kept several Century 21 Exposition silver dollar tokens used as currency at the fairgrounds in a secret hiding spot in my bedroom, along with a batch of old silver dollars from my mother. I saved a copy of the ubiquitous sky blue colored official World's Fair guidebook, which is circulating among all of you there. Down the hill from our house toward the east, Beacon Hill dipped into Rainier Valley, an adjoining neighborhood of ramshackle homes and small businesses along Rainier Avenue South, the main thoroughfare slicing through the valley. At the corner of College Street and Rainier was a small IGA grocery. I went there to buy ice cream, popsicles, cap guns, greeny stickum caps, and red balsa gliders propelled by a rubber band. Further down Rainier Avenue South were two adjacent stores, Tradewell, another grocery, and Pay and Save, a drugstore with huge blue and green block letters spelling out its name. My friends and I called it Pay and Lose. I went there for the latest vinyl records, 45 RPM singles, or the more expensive long-playing albums. I picked up the latest free copy of the Big 40 Song Hits leaflet distributed by radio music station KOL 1300 AM. I'm not sure there were very many FM stations back then, right? My one steadfast companion was a plastic, pocket-sized AM transistor radio. It had a long, thin strap, and it came in a black, fake leather carrying case. I wrapped it in an old white handkerchief from my father. I don't know if people carry handkerchiefs anymore. It was usually tuned to KOL, KJR, or KYAC, which aired the latest chart hits. I also followed live broadcasts of the Seattle Rainiers, our marquee sports franchise, a minor league baseball team in the Pacific Coast League, and the Seattle Totems, a professional hockey team that played in the Seattle Civic Ice Arena. I listened to Garner Ted Armstrong sermonize about the imminent disaster facing civilization during the half-hour broadcast, The World Tomorrow. The Rainiers played at 6 Seattle Stadium, 1/2 mile down the hill from us. The ballpark occupied a full block along Rainier Avenue South and McClellan Street. I think it's Lowe's now, right? All right. As a rare treat, my father took us to see a game. We climbed up to the cheap wooden bleachers, gingerly leaning back in our seats so that we wouldn't accidentally catch a wood sliver in our behinds. A paperboy stationed by the entrance to the bleachers hawked the evening edition of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, or the PI. On hot summers, when we opened our living room windows for air, we could hear the PA system announcements of lineup changes, the sharp crack of the bat on well-hit baseballs, and cheering fans. As my mother learned to drive, my father took her to the empty 6 Stadium parking lot on Sunday mornings to practice. I imagined the fear in my father's face and the white-knuckled grip of his hand on the door handle as he handed the car keys to her. She became one of the first Chinese garment workers on Beacon Hill with a driver's license. Other women came to the house before the sun rose, piling into the car for a ride to Chinatown, a short bus ride away from the sewing factories in Pioneer Square. My father also helped me to drive. I took a summer driver's education class at Rainier Beach High School. When we drove to the Department of Motor Vehicles office on Rainier Avenue South to take my test for a permanent license, I was so nervous that I got involved in a fender bender with another vehicle. I was terrified. We both pulled over the side of the road. "Stay here, Ronald," my father directed. He got out and walked over to the other driver. He opened his wallet and offered a few $20 and $10 bills to pay for the damage. The other driver took the money and left. My father got back into the car. I was relieved, but I also felt awful. I knew how little he made as a waiter at the Hong Kong restaurant. My father didn't chastise me. He simply said, "Let's go, Ronald. We're late. We need to get your license." On Sundays, when my mother enjoyed a day off from work, she took all of us kids on leisurely drives up and down Beacon Avenue South in her big red Chevrolet 4-door sedan. We passed by the Jefferson Golf Course on our left as we headed south. Wire fencing and tall, lush trees framed the outer edge of the neatly trimmed green fairways. On our right, we passed a water reservoir, a golf clubhouse, a lawn bowling green, and the Veterans Administration Hospital. I think those are all still there today. Something hasn't changed. Traffic was sparse, especially south of the Beacon Avenue junction. The street was divided by a wide gravel medium strip, which allowed my mother to dip in and out of traffic. She drove well below the speed limit, incurring the wrath of those behind her. They honked their horns and rolled down their windows to scold her. "Ignore them," she sneered in Chinese. "It's dangerous to drive too fast. They can always go around me." Inspecting the speedometer, I pointed out to her that she was only going 15 miles an hour. My brothers and I rolled down the back windows and threw wet wads of paper into the open windows of empty parked cars along the street as my mother drove. We kept score. We never got caught. With the arrival of spring, I couldn't wait to strip down to my ragged t-shirt and shorts and go outside. Near our back porch, a tall rhododendron bush exploded with bright red blossoms in late April. It's funny, I just noticed as I left my house, there's a big red rhododendron bush in my house now. I still live on Beacon Hill, a different location. I climbed the steep rockery surrounding the yard, pausing to whiff the pink carnations and yellow daffodils that my father had planted between the rocks. One big rock with a flat ledge served as a make-believe fortress. I scoured for ants, especially the big red ones. I used a popsicle stick to dig under the crabgrass sprouting between rocks. I trapped the ants in an old Skippy peanut butter jar and fed them breadcrumbs. My brothers and I put the jar in the freezer to test how long the ants could survive. I also used a jar to catch bees as they hovered over the dandelions. Even if I got stung, I didn't ever experience much swelling or pain. We found earwigs in the basement. We called them scissor bugs. Linda, that's my older sister, kept a few as little pets in her room, housing them in a plastic toothbrush case. She named one Scissory. She took them outside for walks and fed them bits of dandelion. All summer, my knees had big bloody scabs. I was forever injuring myself. Even long pants didn't shield me. I managed to imprint them with permanent grass stains and rip through the thick knee patches that my mother sewed on. On hot days, I would lie on my back and breathe in the sweet scent of grass. I stared up at the heavens, watching the white clouds drift across the deep blue sky. I looked for the shape of animals and human faces. I dreamed about riding a rocket ship on an expedition to outer space. I wondered if two-headed aliens with big brains lived on distant planets. I fell asleep, hypnotized by the slow dance of clouds and cooled by a soft breeze. A long dirt alley between College and Bayview Streets connected our property to that of our Chinese, Filipino, and African American neighbors. We dubbed the alley the Jungle. It was filled with shrubs, untamed blackberry bushes, and tall grasses. Drivers unfamiliar with the neighborhood tried to take a shortcut through the alley, only to find their tires churning in the mire of wet earth hidden below. My father mowed the lawn every other Thursday. He handled the push mower. I emptied the grass trimmings from the canvas catcher bag into a cardboard box. I dumped them in the jungle and tamped them down with my feet. I also dug the weeds out of the sidewalk cracks with a trowel and edged the lawn with a heavy pickaxe. The growing number of cracks in the sidewalks around our house mirrored the steady aging of Beacon Hill. When we first moved in, the sidewalk had few imperfections. The concrete had been poured into uniform chalk white squares. But as the seasons came and went, the sidewalk turned dull gray, stained by foot traffic, bird droppings, bicycle, tire tracks, ground-in dirt, and small pebbles. Weeds and grass appeared in the seams. By my late teens, the sidewalk cracks had devolved into a massive web of interlocking tributaries. Near our garage, the concrete buckled and broke off in little wedges, creating a perilous walking surface. I patiently scooped out the weeds, trying to restore orderliness to the sidewalk. The growth stubbornly returned after several days of rain. My parents thought it was hopeless. They told me to focus on removing dandelions and weeds from the lawn and crabgrass from the rockery. The grass already had brown patches and bald spots. But I couldn't let the sidewalks go unattended. I wanted them to return to the way they looked when we first moved in. Year after year, I spent hours crouched over the cracks on the pavement with a trowel and cardboard box, the sun beating down on me while I worked. After I finished, I vigorously swept the sidewalks clean with a stiff broom. I cared, even if no one else did. So that's the chapter. Thank you. I shared that again partly because obviously the topic of my talk was Beacon Hill, but it's give you the flavor of kind of, even in those early years, I kind of saw the neighborhood changing in front of my eyes. And I think even today, I live on Beacon Hill. I go by the cracked pavement and I look, and it's a mess. It's all in pieces. And I feel sad in a way, but I also feel nostalgic because a lot of childhood memories of growing up in a fairly much simpler time come back to me. And I see how Seattle has changed in the post-Amazon era with new arrivals. There's still some of these sewing ladies in their 90s living in the neighborhood. You can tell where they live because they don't have any gardeners. They got iron bars, around the windows. And there's a real contrast between what Seattle once was and what it's become. And I think we need to be mindful of that. I wrote this book as a little bit of, to share my memories in the hope of spurring many of you also to do your memoirs, whether it's simply for your grandkids or it's wonderful if you want to keep cognitively, engaged in a way that keeps you healthy. It's wonderful exercise, and it certainly was for me. The book is sort of sold out. I have 2 copies here. I'm willing to sell them. They're the only ones. I have one more at home, and then another friend has stashed away a couple. I'm working on a reprint. There's a donor who stepped forward and says, we got to reprint this book, and so hopefully there'll be a new old edition. It's basically be the same thing with a few corrections, typos. Hopefully within the next 6 months or so. The audiobook, which Susan mentioned, was completed. There was a program at Town Hall that I was part of. If you go to my website, Chew Communications, you can log in and access. It's on YouTube, but it's a private. You have to get the code to get in. So you can skip ahead and listen to me talk and read any of these chapters in a little more perfect form. And yeah, I think those are the main things. Mindful of time. questions anybody has?
What part of Beacon Hill are you living on now?
I am on North Beacon Hill near 19th and in between Stevens and Hanford Street. Not far from Red Apple Market. Yeah. Are you familiar with that area? Yeah. Okay, yeah.
I lived,
Which elementary school did you go to?
So I attended the old Beacon Hill Elementary School, which is now El Centro de la Raza. It was taken over by Roberto Maestas, leader of El Centro de la Raza, and a group of his followers. And so that Latino Community Center is my old elementary school. I actually, there's another chapter I write about attending Franklin High School. I don't know if anybody's a Franklin High School grad. Okay, I see some. Okay, yeah, I write about the civil rights movement era when black students took over the school. And Roberto Maestas was my Spanish teacher. Back then, I remember him as Robert Maestas, Mr. Maestas. But I later came to know him as a fellow activist, and he always kept boasting that, Ronald Chu was one of my students. He didn't mention I wasn't a particularly good student, but nonetheless, we spent a lot of time together.
I thank you for reading that. I read your book and loved it, but it's been a couple years now. So just hearing it again and how you describe the sites and experience you've had, it's just marvelous. I had an impression when I read it that you said that you didn't learn English until you got to Mercer Junior High. And I've been struggling with that because we could see you read library books when you were in 5th grade, I think that was. But could you talk about that, about how you learned English?
So I cheated, that library reading club. I could barely read. So, the librarian, Miss O'Brien, she didn't really check. She said, "What did you read?" I'd point, and there's that book. I picked the ones with the most pictures, the shortest ones, because I wanted my name on that window. So I don't remember precisely when I was able to transition over. It was a very rough period where I was kind of in the sort of no man's land between languages. So I can relate to a lot of the kids, especially the ones still immigrating over. It's tough because sometimes you're quiet because you just don't. You're thinking in 2 different languages, and then you're struggling to be accepted, right, by your peers. So, you start becoming assimilated more quickly than is healthy, and then you become estranged from your parents and your own community. So, in terms of the precise time of when that transition, it was kind of a dead zone where I didn't do well in school, and I, probably would have been attending these special classes during elementary school had it not been for the fact that my mother, in getting these notices about taking classes, didn't know what they were, and she just threw them away. Anything else?
Gary Locke was a great legislator, very effective on the floor. Gary Locke was a very important legislator, gave important views and went on politically after that. Was there any kind of celebration in the Chinese community when he became governor?
There were quite a number of celebrations in the Chinatown International District area among some of the Chinese family associations. I should mention his father is an unsung hero in that journey towards him becoming governor, and certainly when he was elected as a state legislator, because his dad would go to these family association meetings and he'd make the plug for his son. And so, he's since passed away, but he was a wonderful, gregarious person who had a lot of credibility within the community.
Would you point to where your book is?
On the map, where did you grow up? Where is your book position?
So, let me see here. Yeah, I'm.
All right, that's all right. Don't worry.
I
Don't
won't-
worry.
Yeah, so up in the North Beacon Hill area. Yeah.
Would you speak a bit about your parents, when they came, or were they U.S. born, and where they came from?
Yeah. So my grandfather, my father's father, came in 1911. He was the first person in my family to arrive. He came here illegally, as did 90+% of Chinese, because you couldn't come here legally if you were a Chinese laborer because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed in 1882. So invariably, the way the Chinese came here, and they were driven here really by war and poverty and famine, as with many of the folks who come here even today. He came here as a returning citizen under fabricated documentation that said he was born on Occidental Avenue in the 1870s or some such thing. And so when he was coming here, his documentation said, well, he was actually born in Seattle, when in fact he was coming for the first time. That was made possible by the fact that the immigration records were in San Francisco, and they were all destroyed during the Great San Francisco Fire, you see. So, funny thing, after 1906, 1907, all these returning Chinese born citizens came to America. So anyway, grandfather came in 1911. Because he was an American-born citizen, he could bring my father over from China, because my grandfather, periodically would go back to China and have kids and so forth. Anyway, when my father reached age 13, he came here to Seattle to join his father as the son of an American-born citizen. And then my uncles could come as well. However, my mother didn't come until 1950 because Chinese women couldn't come here. If you were a Chinese woman under Chinese Exclusion Act, you just couldn't come. So you had bachelor generation, which I grew up with working in the Hong Kong restaurant, of men with wives back in China that they would periodically visit. So my parents themselves were separated for, I think, 11 years, even though from the time they were married. And then myself and my siblings were born in America in the 1950s. I did have an older brother in China who was born 1937, 38, when my father had returned to get married. He didn't survive, and so like many of us, we have half of our lives here and half still in the old country. Does that make sense? Yeah.
We're going to do a series of programs on Beacon Hill. What is it you'd really want us to know about Beacon Hill as we do those programs? What do you hope that we discover about that area of Seattle?
Well, Beacon Hill is an incredible transition point. As I mentioned at the outset, a lot of us have our roots in this restrictive covenant history of Seattle, where you couldn't live in places, in many of the neighborhoods throughout the city. Wing Luke, interestingly enough, namesake of the museum where I worked for 17 years, was involved in the Open Housing Act, which, opened up and superseded the restrictive covenants. So a lot of us Beacon Hill is very special to the Chinese American community. It's very special to a lot of the communities of color because that's where they got their start. And it was like breaking out of a box. Chinatown, to me, still is very special because it's where I worked for many years, bussing dishes, where my mom worked in actually a sewing factory down there, my dad at the restaurant, relatives lived down there. But Beacon Hill was, a beginning point for the immigrant refugee community and still is today. So it'd be important to, as you look at the landmarks and places, they're very, very special in that way.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming, and